All right. Last panel of the day, everyone, and then I hope everyone will stick around for the breakout sessions, which will immediately follow this panel, because that's really when we get to ask all the questions that we didn't have time to ask in the Q&As for each of our panels and the keynote, and really get to talk and dig into a lot of the stuff that we've talked about today. So hopefully you'll stick around for that. As Kate mentioned, it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists for building rural futures, community revitalization in the Intermountain West. We'll first hear from Dr. Shane Doyle, who is a community and environmental advocate who hails from Crow Agency, Montana. Dr. Doyle currently serves as the North America Indigenous Rights Relations Director for the Nature Conservancy, as well as the Executive Director of Yellowstone Peoples, an Indigenous nonprofit that supports and organizes an annual Intertribal Tipi Village event in Yellowstone Park. In his role for the Nature Conservancy, Shane works across the U.S. and Canada to support tribal bison restoration on native lands, as well as the revitalization of Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge and land back to Native communities. Shane lives in Bozeman with his wife and their 5 children, and it's been an absolute joy and honor to know Shane and work with him over the past few years. So I'm really excited for his remarks. Take it away, Shane. Thanks.
Testing. Okay, hey, thanks so much, Andrew, for inviting me, and great to be here. Thanks, everyone. Just wanted to make one small comment on your introduction. My title for the Nature Conservancy is Indigenous Right Relations, and I know it's such a unique and different term and in fact, when I first heard it, didn't understand and wanted to put an S on the end of right as well. But it's actually right relations, speaking as a noun and as a verb. Yep. So, but thank you for that distinction. And so it's just great honor to be on this panel and with all the great speakers here. And, I thought I could start off a little bit by talking about history. That's kind of my area of expertise. And do we have some slides? Or did we have some slides available? Maybe not. Oh, okay. Can you see them? Okay. I can't see them, so that's kind of an issue for me. Yeah, maybe I'll stand up there. Hey, I guess I don't need this, do I? All right, thanks again. Just want to take a few minutes, and how much time do I have here? How much, are we thinking about maybe 5 minutes per person? About 12 minutes, okay, and then we'll mix it up towards the end. Just wanted to take a little bit of time to take a deep dive into Montana history, because I feel like at an event like this, it's important to really understand where we're at. It's easy to talk about rural. You can talk about it like it's a big checkerboard, right? And all the squares are just the same. That's what white people did when they first came here and actually when they came to the continent, right? Following English colonial land law, let's cut everything up into little squares and then we'll divvy it all up. That was the whole process. And so thinking about the West, though, it's not like that. It's not all the same. Every square is different. And it's very dynamic. And in fact, we know here in Montana, it's very much a niche place, isn't it? If you're up at Bridger Bowl or down here in the valley, you're going to experience very different climate, very different plants, different animals. And so Montana is a very distinct, unique spot on the map. And when you talk about rural Montana and rural Wyoming, I think very different things. Rural Colorado, sometimes we like to lump them all together, but I think in Montana it's very, very distinct, and that's kind of what I want to emphasize today. I like to refer to Montana as medicine wheel country, because everybody who lived here for the past, since time immemorial, was using this medicine wheel as the basis of their seasonal movements, of the basis of their understanding of relationships. It was a three-dimensional map for them. It had scientific purpose as well as ceremonial. You know, the world-famous Sundance ceremony is only practiced in the same geographic region where we find the medicine wheel, and that's just in Montana, and a little bit in Wyoming, and a little bit in Canada and the Dakotas. But once you leave that zone, you know, you don't see people sundancing anymore, and you don't see the medicine wheels, and you don't see the culture that's associated with all that. And it's a very unique, distinct culture that has kind of like rock and roll, jazz, and so many other great expressions of art and music has kind of taken over the continent. It's swept from coast to coast. So now if you go to a powwow like the one that's going to happen here this weekend in Bozeman, or if you go to one in Hollywood, Florida, or Seattle, Washington, you're going to hear the same music, and it's coming from Montana. Very powerful, intertribal, cultural way of life. Let's move on to my next slide. So this is kind of a fuzzy, it didn't turn out very well, did it? The image got pretty fuzzy. I was trying to, you know, get a clear view of this. Has anyone seen this before? So anyone seen me talk before has seen it. John has probably seen it half a dozen times. This is a map. If you think about it, I've looked at this map a lot, and it's basically a map of Montana. Right in the middle there is Yellowstone Park, and you can see where the four lines intersect. This map is from 1801, and it was drawn for a guy who came to this, for a white man. A Blackfoot chief drew this map for him, and the man came here for business purposes. He wanted to trade. He set up a fort in Canada at the confluence of the Red Deer and Saskatchewan rivers, and he wanted information about the local area. And so this Blackfoot chief came in, and instead of giving him information about the local area, he basically drew him a map of Montana and told him, if you want to do business, you'll have to go to Montana. And all those little lines that you see there moving downward from the middle of the page, those are tributaries of the Missouri River. And the two lines that are perpendicular to each other, or parallel to each other towards the middle of the page, that's the Continental Divide. And then on the west side, or in this instance, the top side of the paper, you see two rivers as well. On one side of the page, that's the Snake and the Columbia River. And the people who lived in this zone here, they all had a way of life that was dependent upon seasonal movement. And so because of that, this was a dynamic and cosmopolitan place. And if you'll notice, Wyoming doesn't really show up on this map. You know, it's the river way down on the, I guess on the left side of the page, that's the Bighorn River going down into Wyoming. And again, on the other side of the Continental Divide, you see a bunch of writing there, and that was like ethnographic information about the names of the people and how many campsites, how many tents, he writes in the journal here. But again, the people who lived here, the Medicine Wheel country, they were moving camps from winter, spring, summer, fall. This was a way of life that it was a necessity here in Montana, because the people who lived here, and this is one of the, I think, a remarkable thing about Montana, many of the tribes who end up coming here gave up their agricultural way of life because when they came here to Montana, they figured out real quick, this is not a good place to be a farmer. But if you want to hunt and you like buffalo meat, you know, you could be in a worse place, you know. And then there's all kinds of roots and berries and other things that grow wild. In fact, you couldn't kill them if you tried. People sometimes often do, of course, try to kill things like raspberry bushes and other stuff that come up wild. My tribe is an example. We were full-time agriculturalists. Our whole way of life, our clan system, everything was based on corn growing, squash, beans. But yet when we came here to Montana, we put all that aside. We put it all down and became full-time hunter-gatherers and traders. And that's what another thing I want to emphasize. People talk about hunters and gatherers all the time. But in Montana, we're all reliant upon trade. And not just tactile stuff that we can eat and put on our bodies or hang on the wall or play with our fingers with piano. We're contingent upon ideas. We're trading songs, we're trading ceremonies, we're trading jokes, a lot of jokes, some of them really bad, some of them not too bad. A lot of the human condition that is traded through like plain sign language and other aspects that all started here in this cosmopolitan place. And that's one of the things that held white people off for so long. They looked at this place and they said, there's nothing there, man. There's no water. The ground is mean. Sometimes it snows in the spring real early. Sometimes it snows real late in the fall. You never know if it's going to be a drought. Until the gold came. And ever since then, people have been wondering, what are we supposed to do in Montana? But here's a suggestion. Bring buffalo back. You know, it's just a suggestion. You know, they're good for the ground. They're good for the people. They do wonders for a person's spirit. If you're feeling down in the dumps, go hang out around buffalo for a little bit. You know, the odds are you're going to feel better when you're done. And so that's kind of my soapbox. Someone else was talking about a soapbox too. Yeah, I appreciate it. Can we go on to the next slide? Now here we are revitalizing these rural reservation economies is a big lift. But we have it within our power. We have it within our grasp. We have it within our imaginations to reshape and re-envision who we are and what we are as modern tribal communities in the 21st century. I'm excited. I'm hopeful. You know, there's a lot of really talented, really motivated, highly charged young people that are going to be, you know, helping us lead the way. But I wanted to share this image with you because that X site there, which is about 40 miles to the east of us here, is the oldest burial in the Western Hemisphere. And, you know, that's not an accident. I think that Montana is a very special place for a lot of reasons, and I'm glad we're having this opportunity to think deeply and thoughtfully about how we make a living here. And so I just wanted to contribute a little bit of historical foundation for the conversation going forward. And thank you again so much for the opportunity.
Thanks, Shane. That was great. Our next speaker is Andrew Huff, who is the Senior Policy and Legal Advisor to Center Indian Country Development, or CICD. He's an enrolled member of the Rocky Boys Reservation, Chippewa Cree Tribe of North Central Montana. He graduated from Harvard College in 1991 and the University of Colorado Law School in 1999. Over the course of his legal career, Huff has served in a variety of positions, including as a tribal judge for the Rocky Boys Indian Reservation, as chief legal counsel to Governor of Montana from 2013 to 2017, and as an Assistant Attorney General for the Montana Department of Justice between 2010 and 2012.
Well, good afternoon, and thanks for having me. Again, I'm Andy Huff. I'm Senior Policy and Legal Advisor to the Center for Indian Country Development. That's a research and policy institute. We study how Indian country economies are working in the lower 48, but also in Alaska and Hawaii. We are part of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, which brings me to my next slide. The views expressed here are my own and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve System or the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. All right, and I actually don't have much of a slide presentation for you, but this slide gives you an idea of kind of the research that we do in Indian country. We look at all sorts of different issues, and what we're really trying to do is understand how economies work or don't in Indian country. And it's part of the whole Federal Reserve System to understand how economies are working in every region throughout the country. And that flows up into all sorts of policy decisions, including, open market interest rate decisions, things like that. We have to understand how all the economies in this country are working. So you can see from that slide some of the things that we work on. And then I wanted to be sure to get a QR code in front of all of you. This is one thing I encourage you to check out. I'm not going to talk about this during my 10 minutes, but we also produce a lot of data tools that are focused on Indian country. And you can get onto our website, and instead of kind of scraping, I guess you can use AI now, but anyway, the old way was you'd scrape around on the internet looking for information about various Indian country geographies and do your best to find information. This makes it a lot easier. You can go to our website and you can get a lot of information about any native geography that you want to know. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about my great-grandfather. He was a fellow by the name of William Bushy. He's also known as Old Man Bushy. And he was born in Fort Vermilion, Alberta, which is way northern Alberta. He's a Cree Indian, born in 1853. He was a hunter and a trapper, and this guy was mobile. His territory included huge swaths of land, and he moved around all the time. So pretty much Alberta, Saskatchewan. He went down to Red Lake, Minnesota. He traveled through the Dakotas. He went over into Montana, and of course, completed that whole circuit many times. And perhaps in all of that land, his favorite area, the area that he was most attached to, was the area between Augusta and Chief Mountain up by the Canadian border. And he, in fact, spent quite a bit of time at the Marias Pass area and Hart Butte. He loved that area. He was deeply, deeply attached to that area. But all of that is very interesting. William Bushy was even more interesting than that because he was kind of an activist. In his wanderings throughout this massive area in the 1870s, he led a group of folks from the Red Lake, Minnesota area into Montana. And they basically followed the Missouri River. They kind of used the carcasses of dead bison to survive during that trek because by then the slaughter of the bison had started. And although they did take live bison, most of the bison that they used in their trek from Minnesota over into Montana had already passed on. And they stopped eventually in Montana, south of present-day Rocky Boys Reservation. In that group of people was a fellow by the name of Louis Riel. And Mr. Riel was in that group of people because he'd been expelled from Canada. Sorry, he was expelled from Canada for leading basically a land rights, Indigenous land rights movement, which the Canadians weren't very fond of. So, although he was successful in getting the province of Manitoba established as part of this Indigenous land rights movement in Canada, he did get himself expelled. That was in 1869. So he had to spend some time in Montana. And as William was leading these folks, across the northern tier of the United States into Montana, he listened. He listened to Louis Riel, and he listened to his beliefs about land rights and the importance of land rights for Native people, and how Native people were being displaced because they didn't have rights to their own land. And he was talking about Canada, but William was listening. Louis eventually went back to Canada, and he led a second rebellion there in 1885. These are called the Riel rebellions. And that rebellion involved Chippewa, Cree people, but also the Métis people in Canada. And they were fighting primarily the Canadian government for the right to have land up there, to have recognized land areas where they could live permanently as Indigenous people. That second rebellion did not go well. The natives lost. They were scattered in various places, and Louis Riel was executed. But William, thankfully, didn't go north for that second rebellion. What he did was he stayed in Montana, and he started working with various folks in Montana, including C.M. Russell, Paris Gibson, Frank Linderman, to ultimately help to establish the Rocky Boys Indian Reservation, which was established here in Montana in 1916. And a lot of the folks that were in Montana, a lot of the Indian folks that needed that reservation, they needed a place because they had been scattered and dispersed with respect to the Riel Rebellion up in Canada. But also that area that now is where Rocky Boys is, was part of an area used by many tribes for buffalo hunting. And of course, the Plains Cree used that area quite a bit. They came down from Canada into Montana regularly to hunt the bison. And just like what Shane was saying, the Plains Cree had kind of a journey culturally from Woods Cree into buffalo hunters on the plains. And the reason they became buffalo hunters on the plains is because the buffalo were so plentiful. It was just a way of life that once it was started, there was no reason to do anything else. But of course, when the buffalo were slaughtered, that became very problematic. There was starvation followed, and that was one of the things that led ultimately to the conflicts up in Canada. So why am I talking about William Bushy? For a lot of reasons. He helped establish Rocky Boys Indian Reservation, which was a permanent place for the Chippewa Cree people. But he himself wanted to stay on his own piece of land in that area that he loved, between Augusta and Chief Mountain, preferably in the Marias Pass area. And so he tried to homestead twice. He tried to get a homestead patent twice in that area, and he was rejected both times. He couldn't get a patent to his own land that he had improved because he was an American Indian. So the reason I'm talking about William Bushy, my great-grandfather, is because he was grappling with the very same issues that we're talking about today, that everybody in this room is talking about, and that Native peoples grapple with to this very day. And that issue is how to live a dignified life, a meaningful life on land and in geographies that we're all very deeply attached to, but that might not necessarily be the easiest place to make a living for whatever reason. For William, he couldn't get a patent because he was Indian. but he was successful in establishing with others the Rocky Boys Indian Reservation. So this question is particularly important for Native peoples for two reasons. We've been talking a lot about culture today. Native peoples are deeply attached to their traditional territories and to the territories that now comprise their homelands. And it's a attachment that is at several levels. Of course, Indians, they get their physical livelihood from their lands, but also there's deep cultural attachments. Our languages are based very frequently on the geographies where we live. Our traditions, our religions, all come from our traditional lands and the lands that we're presently at. For a second reason, this is very important. Because of those deep attachments, the loss of American Indian land was very traumatic. So everybody in this room knows that between 1770s and about 1934, American Indians lost almost all of their land. They lost it first in the first wave of treaties and removals that happened in the first 100 years between 1770s and 1871. But then they lost a whole nother round of land during the allotment era from about 1887 to 1934. So that led to deep generational poverty because those were the resources that Indian people depended on to live and that they would have needed to have thriving communities into the future. So for many generations, there was grinding poverty on Indian reservations in the lower 48, a kind of generational poverty. Now, there is good news. That's what I want to talk about very briefly. I'll give you a statistic because I'm from the Federal Reserve System, so I have to give you at least one statistic. But this is a statistic about the family poverty rate. And what it shows is that things are improving on reservations, but at the same time, there's a long way to go. So the statistic is that the on-reservation family poverty rate in 1990 for people living on American Indian reservations was 44.1%. So that means that 44.1% of people living on reservations in 1990 were living at or below the family poverty level. Today, in 2020, that statistic has fallen to 23%. So that's a huge drop in the family poverty rate. That is really good news. So things are getting better. But then you have to compare it to the nation at large. In 1990, 10% was the family poverty rate for the nation at large. And by 2020, that was 6.3%. So you got to compare the gap of 23% to 6.3%. There's still a lot of poverty in Indian country. That gap hasn't closed. But there have been some innovations, particularly in the last 30 years, that tribes have relied on to close that gap and to try to stay on those lands that they love. And I'm just going to hit 3 of them in like the last 3 minutes that I have. One is that tribes are starting to reacquire land. They're starting to buy back land. They buy it back in fee. Sometimes they put it into trust, sometimes not. They keep it in fee, or sometimes they, there's an administrative process to move fee lands into trust. And this is kind of a long-term project. This is something that is happening parcel by parcel. And what it really is for tribes is an investment, not so much an economic investment, although there is that piece of it, but an investment in the cultural survival of their communities. That's something that, perhaps there aren't immediate payouts right now, but long into the future, kind of reacquiring those lands is going to be very important for Native people. The other thing that you should know about is tribal enterprises. This is another means that tribes are using to stay on their lands and to thrive as communities. Tribes operate in terms of the public finances differently from other governments. they don't have the same authority to tax. So they have to get revenues in other ways. What do they do instead? They run tribal enterprises. The most famous one is gaming. Gaming, though, has some uneven impacts. Mostly tribes that are near big urban areas have successful gaming ventures, but tribes that are more rural, like the tribes in Montana that aren't really near any big urban areas, they have gaming, but it's not nearly so, they don't get nearly the revenues that other tribes get. But they do have the gaming. The other thing that they're doing is federal contracting. Tribes have become serious federal contractors, and in the last 20 years, they've earned, actually it's last 40 years, they've earned $202 billion contracting with the federal government. They contract mostly, well, with a variety of agencies, but a huge bit of it is Department of Defense contracts. So the reason these two things are important is because they're giving the revenues that tribes need to fund services on the reservation, make investments in their communities. Gaming is limited to trust lands. The contracting can be done anywhere. And so the place of performance of those contracts is throughout the country. And again, they do quite a bit of defense contracting. So that has enabled tribes to get revenues and stay, especially rural tribes, be able to fund services for their communities. And then very briefly, last, I'm at zero, Native Community Development Financial Institutions. If you look at a map of the reservations, and also you overlay that with a map of what's called banking deserts in this country, you realize that there hasn't been a lot of traditional lending for mortgages and small businesses in Indian country. And that's just been the reality. There's for a whole lot of reasons, but that has impacted small business development, buying a home, things like that in Indian country. Native CDFIs are kind of alternative to banks. They were created in the mid-1990s. CDFIs in general were created in the mid-1990s. Native CDFIs serve specifically Indian lands and Native communities, and they make capital and credit available to people buying homes and starting businesses. And the reason they're important is because they know those communities, and they work with the people that they give loans to make sure those loans benefit not only that person but the community, and that they get paid back. So it's kind of an alternative to traditional banking, and it's really grown in the last 20 years, and it will be a game changer into the future. So that's what I will leave you with, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Andy. So much to talk about after this panel. It's great. So our next speaker is Cole Mannix. Cole grew up on a ranch that's been run by his family since 1882 near Helmville, Montana. Today, his parents, aunts, uncles, and siblings and cousins run the ranch together. Cole lives about 60 miles east of the ranch in Helena, where he serves as president of Old Salt Co-op, of which his family's ranch is a founding member. Old Salt is a regenerative marketplace for American meat, owned and governed by the ranch members that supply it. Cole and his wife have 2 young sons. He enjoys good food, good company, and live music in small venues. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'll begin by thanking Justin for the image of dunking on someone's inward journey. That gave me a little levity. I'll start just a second with my personal story. Is that I found myself after undergraduate school in Boston, having gone to a very, very small school. I was the only kid in my graduating class in 8th grade in Helmville, Montana. And a few things happened there for me. One is that I just encountered a lot of interest about the West and about grazing, about some ideas about ranching, some ideas about meat that that caused me to kind of re-examine where I had come from and see it in a new light and start to read deeply about the place I had come from. And my graduate program was in theology, and I was interested in questions about what is worth serving and, you know, why are we here? And didn't figure that out. I was interested in questions about social justice. We took a trip to El Salvador, one to Honduras, and the point of those trips were to learn that social justice really starts at home, and that I realized how much impact our economy and our politics had on their world, and began to form an idea of social justice as cleaning up my own house and going home and seeing if I could make our economy maybe a little bit more just place. I had been reading Wendell Berry, and the idea of homecoming and learning to belong to a place felt powerful to me. And then, meanwhile, I had come from a valley in the Blackfoot where there had been, you know, some decades of really powerful collaboration around what the people who lived there hoped it might look like, you know, in the future, some visioning. And there was a lot of, I remember when I was in high school, we were driving to school to Drummond one morning in the late 1990s, and there was a wolf hanging from the stop sign as a symbol of some people who didn't like the reintroductions in Yellowstone. And the Blackfoot Valley was a place where there was a lot of work done around how can we coexist with animals that we're proud still occupy this landscape and that we'd like to try to coexist with. I was proud of the collaboration in that place. And I think the Blackfoot Challenge, which is a big part of that community, Jennifer is here today, they hosted people from all over the world to come to the place and to have discussions and so that we could learn. And I think I had an awareness of how small of a place Helmville was, how much we needed the outside world, but needed to maintain who we were. And there was a strong culture there, and the question was, hey, the world is changing fast. Will we have a stable enough foundation to retain the most important part of who we are? Fast forwarding a little bit to the beginning of Old Soul, I found myself, my family's ranch was trying to figure out how are we going to adapt and survive into the future. And I found myself in early 2020 at a meeting with Cooper Hibbert of Sebin Livestock Company and Andrew and Hillary Anderson of the J. Bar L Ranches, and then my own family, and we were discussing the future of ranching. And each one of those people, kind of agreed that while the ranches at the time were profitable and they felt that they were on a good ecological trajectory, they were worried that the trajectory of economics and of the marketplace would probably leave us out of business within a generation, and that we needed to change things, needed to try to change things. And another thing that I had, come to know about the people in that room was that they had a different way maybe of looking at land ownership. They took it a lot more lightly. They saw themselves as short-timers. They saw themselves as part of something bigger, and they wanted to serve something called the common good, even though it's hard to articulate. And so yeah, they had an ethic to leave it better. And so we decided, we got snowed in an extra day in Melville in November, and so we had a lot of time to spend together. And we decided that the status quo was riskier than any business we might try to start. And so we decided we would start with a meat company, because that's mostly what we raise is cattle and some sheep. But that the parent company that owned that meat, the parent company that sort of governed things would be majority controlled by the producers that supplied it and by the workers, minority controlled by the workers who worked in it. We agreed that we didn't have the capital to make it happen, and so that we would have to find that from outside folks who would not sit on the board so that it could maintain its North Star. And we decided we didn't like the world of certifications and branding because it seemed shallow. And so we wanted to try to connect with the customer base in a more experiential way, the way that we, as people, we have built trust for a long time, which is sort of in person, seeing each other in multiple contexts and see if we show up with integrity. I don't know if my little video is going to work, but I'm gonna try. This is a silent video, by the way, and short. Gives you little images of the Old Salt ecosystem. This is the Union restaurant that we operate in Helena. This is Cooper Hibbert, our board chair. Old Salt Festival in the Blackfoot Valley that happens every summer solstice. This is Augusta. Back to the festival, part of the butcher shop. I'm sorry that you guys can't see it, but a moment of silence. Working to learn to make friends with beavers again. So our goal was not to create a meat brand, but our goal was to try to create a little mini food system, a little mini marketplace. And so that ended up being restaurants, and it ended up being meat processing, and it ended up being wholesale meat sales, and it ended up being e-commerce meat sales, and then events as a way to build a community. I think that's what a brand is a group of people who sort of share a set of values. And I think anything that's worth a damn about what we're trying to do comes from a way of seeing ourselves as and our own well-being as intrinsically linked to that of our neighbor, and defining neighbor more broadly as nature as well, that we're part of. And so the question for us is, how do we build a business and a business ecosystem that serves that way of seeing? Livestock aren't perfect, and we don't see meat or livestock as a panacea or a silver bullet. But we do think there is a way to manage livestock in an elegant way on the Western landscape. Cattle and bison, and probably bison more so. We're less familiar with that. We could learn. And so we believe in animal products. We believe in animal impact on rangeland, thoughtfully managed, and also animal integration into our cropping systems to make them more sustainable and use less inputs. And we also believe in meat as a nourishing human food that's been with us a long time and is not a new kid on the block. And basically what we tell ourselves is our enemy is the vicious cycle, vicious economic cycle, which is basically how do you capture value downstream and return value to a few founders and investors. And we're trying to create a little mini virtuous cycle that returns value to the place that it's really created. I think, stewardship is not really about technology. Your technology is only so good as the culture that wields it. And so we're trying to create a business ecosystem that supports what stewardship really is, which is love. It's people applying their talents and passions over time and failing sometimes, but working to get better and iterating. Just like taking care of a child, that's what stewardship is. It takes patience. So our vision is to try to build this little business within 10 years that would be about 60 to 70 million in sales, and where that number comes from is just kind of the scale you need economically to make a processing facility work at the medium scale that we think is possible. We think within 3 years our goal is to have 12 restaurants where people can experience the brand and the product, but also pick up the meat that they ordered online and also experience some retail meat. This is our first restaurant, the Outpost, we found it started in the fall of 21. This is the next restaurant called The Union, also in Helena. We're hoping that the next two would be in Livingston and Bozeman, so we'll see. This is an image of the Blackfoot Valley and Old Salt Festival. Last year we had about 3,000 people over 3 days, and it's one of my favorite things is that I mentioned that Wendell Berry is a hero of mine, and his daughter reached out last year wanting to talk about the way we had structured the co-op. They're doing something. They had a thing called the Burley Tobacco Cooperative that from 1910 to 1960 provided a lot of stability for that region of Henry County that he writes out of. And so she's going to be talking at the festival this year about how does a business structure help to stabilize a culture. Meriwether Hardy is the great ancestor of Meriwether Lewis and rode her horses across the Dakotas and Montana this summer, and we'll be doing a thing called the Core of Rediscovery and trying to, how do we learn to belong to this place a little better. This is sort of what our meat boxes look like when they arrive in the mail for folks. And this is my last slide. This year, if you have any interest in the festival, there's a lot of talks on the food system and on conservation and poetry, and there's a maker's tent with people who are making a lot of beautiful different art and products. There's music over the course of the 3 days and live fire cooking, and it's a wonderful time. It's June 19th to the 21st this year. So I'll end with that. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Cole. That was great. And last but not least, we have Megan Torgerson, who was raised on the windswept Great Plains of Dagmar, Montana, is a farmer's daughter and the founder of the documentary podcast series Reframing Rural. Just curious, who here in this room has heard of Reframing Rural? All right, got some claps over there. That's great. Some fans. So Megan holds an MFA in Arts Leadership from Seattle University and a BA in English with a creative nonfiction emphasis from the University of Montana. For her work on Reframing Rural, she's been awarded numerous grants and fellowships, including the inaugural Public Humanities Fellowship from Humanities Washington. And since returning to Montana in 2023, she's lent her knowledge of agriculture, rural spaces, and storytelling to documentary film projects, needs assessments, keynotes, and educational courses for organizations, including the Red Ends Pants Foundation, Montana Farmers Union, and MSU Extension. Megan lives in Missoula, and she lives there with her husband and their son. Take it away. Thanks.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Cole, I have a slide about being one of 3 in my junior high class, so you beat me, one and only kid graduating in the 8th grade. That's incredible. I'm going to start by sharing with you a bit about the place that raised me and the work that I do today as a keeper and teller of rural stories. And then I'll share with you a little bit about the reporting that I've been doing lately on farm and ranch succession and on childcare in rural communities. I am a child of the prairie and a farmer and rancher's daughter from Dagmar, Montana. Dagmar is in the extreme northeast corner of the state. It's a stone's throw from Saskatchewan and North Dakota on the ancestral lands of the Blackfeet, Assiniboine, and Sioux. And growing up in rural Montana in the 90s and early 2000s, there was an unspoken understanding that if I were to make something of my life, that I would have to leave the farm and ranch that my family's life has centered on for generations. I was born just after the 80s farm crisis, a difficult time to make it in agriculture, when land that could once sustain multiple families no longer provided enough for one family to make a living. But as I've learned interviewing family farm advocates like the farmer's lawyer, Sarah Vogel, things started to take a turn in agriculture before the grasshopper infestations and dry winters of the 1980s. In 1972, in an effort to increase the global trade of American agricultural commodities, Earl Butz, the Secretary of Agriculture under President Nixon, encouraged farmers to expand their operations, modernize equipment, and borrow against their land holdings, to get big or get out. In 1972, agricultural exports came in at $8 billion, and by 1981, that number rose to $44 billion. While commodity exports rose, so too did interest rates and inflation. Get big or get out catalyzed the 80s farm crisis, marking a rise in industrialization, productivity, and in the growth of large agribusiness corporations that continue to threaten the sustainability of family farms and agricultural communities like my hometown of Dagmar. Through an unknowable combination of luck and providence, my family has been able to hold fast to the wheat fields, calving grounds, and home place that make up my family's farm and ranch. But the need to get big or get out also survived. I have lived with the impact of these policies. The results include a classroom with 3 kids in them, that's me in the 5th grade. Farmers who are farming larger and larger tracts of land, largely in isolation, that's my dad Russ. And communities where the only open business in town is the post office. This is my hometown of Dagmar, where there are only 10 people living within town proper today. My story and the story of Dagmar really makes the case for the need for rural revitalization. As while I was growing up, it felt like northeastern Montana was fading away. This is the population of Sheridan County, Montana from 1970 to 2020, and the quickly cascading years between 1991 and 2009 were my childhood. 10 years after leaving home, I started to get curious about the place that I left, and I felt called to find and uplift stories from rural and agricultural communities that countered the narratives I was so often hearing of rural decline, despair, and disinvestment. In 2019, I founded Reframing Rural, a documentary podcast that challenges mainstream stereotypes about rural places by introducing listeners to people, history, and culture that don't always get the spotlight. Our mission is to cultivate curiosity and conversation across geographic, class, and cultural divides. I founded Reframing Rural with the desire to create rural stories with greater nuance and care than I was seeing so that rural people could really see themselves more honestly reflected, and so that urban audiences had examples to draw from beyond caricatures of the rural experience. I wanted urban audiences to see rural places beyond their vacation destinations or landscapes they were forced to drive through on their way to someplace else. The author Grace Olmsted, who I interviewed in season 3, wrote in her memoir, Uprooted, Recovering the Legacy of the Places We've Left Behind, that many rural towns are considered interchangeable and expendable, valuable not for their own sake, but because their resources have for many decades been exported to other places by large corporations. These towns' worth or lack thereof is contingent on what other spaces think of them, take from them, or offer them. This extraction of worth, hope, and resources is something farmer and essayist Wendell Berry and economist John Eichard have both referred to as the economic colonization of rural America. It's easy to exploit places we don't know about, Olmsted continued, places we believe to be unimportant. My work seeks to make known that which has been excluded from the frame and to share stories of rural resilience, because if all people hear is that rural communities are dying and that farmers and ranchers are doomed, patterns of extraction and disinvestment will continue. In an effort to offer prospective solutions to one challenge producers are faced with today, farm and ranch succession, in collaboration with the rancher-led nonprofit Win It Aces, we created Reframing Rural's 4th season succession story. Win It Aces, which you've been hearing throughout the day, I'm really glad that so many people are giving them great kudos, views succession as the biggest challenge facing agricultural communities today. It's estimated that over the next 20 years, 1/3 of all farmland will change hands. That's nearly 300 million acres in the US. During this transition, land risks leaving families or agriculture altogether. So through our new podcast season, we're providing examples for how families can navigate succession while encouraging them to make a plan. Succession planning has become increasingly important given the current farm crisis we're faced with. Factors contributing to this crisis include land that's valued for its recreational potential rather than agricultural potential, tariffs causing high input costs, trade wars, combines that cost $1 million, grain prices the same as they were 30 or 40 years ago, a labor shortage, and farm stress and poor mental health. These factors make it harder for both the transition of land and for new farmers and ranchers to break into the industry. Yet the families we profiled in Season 4 Succession Stories are overcoming great odds to keep their family operations intact. Ranchers like the Brusky family in Eccles are revamping their businesses, creating jobs in their community, and seeing the ranch into future generations. The Bruskys are located in Montana's furthest southeast county, Carter County, where they previously both farmed and ranched. From Eccles, the Bruskys are more than 225 miles away from the closest grain elevator, and after a year of bad drought and hail, when they hauled only 4 semi-loads of grain off of their place, they reseeded all of their farmland back into grass and sold off all their farm equipment. Then they sold their mother cow herd. Their neighbors thought that they were either going broke or going crazy. Whoops. Today they are a custom stalker and yearling enterprise. Stalkers are young weaned calves that they buy in the fall and then feed until summer when they sell them to a feedlot or another rancher who uses the cow as a replacement in their herd. And custom yearlings are weaned calves owned by other ranchers that the Bruskys rotationally graze for a fee on their grass. While I know all this sounds really technical, it's revolutionary. The commodity that they sell is no longer beef or wheat, it's grass. While the Bruskys are still ranchers, they've completely revamped their business, and it's paid off, both ecologically and on paper. When the family was still raising crops and cow-calf pairs, that is to say when they were still selling beef and wheat, the Bruskys had no hired help outside of the family. Today, they employ 8 local and foreign employees through the H-2A visa program. They're creating jobs that keep Ecological locals in the county and are bringing people to the area. Thanks in part to changes ranchers like the Bruskys are making and also efforts by organizations like the Carter County Museum, Carter County was second only to Gallatin County in growth between 2010 and 2020. Another rural revitalization story comes from just up the road in Baker, Montana. I went to Baker the fall of 2023 to conduct site visits for a needs assessment I was working on for the Red Ants Pants Foundation's community grant program. There I met Vaughn Zanko, a local father working with the Eastern Plains Economic Development Corporation. When I interviewed Vaughn in 2023, Baker was the center of a 3-county-wide void the size of the state of New Jersey that didn't have a single licensed child care center. The lack of child care was holding back 800 parents in Fallon County from the workforce. While Vaughn was unable to pass bond and levy proposals to fund a licensed child care center, after years of efforts, he was able to get the Baker Child Care Project up and off the ground thanks to partnerships with organizations like the Action for Eastern Montana and 0 to 5 Montana. The Baker Child Care Project opened for enrollment last June, and now Baker has 2 licensed child care centers, the other being a new Head Start. The centers have created jobs and supported families as they re-enter the workforce. Inspired by conversations with Vaughn and the community surrounding the Early Childhood Coalition of Beaverhead County in Dillon, and inspired by the experience of becoming a mom myself, I'm currently working on Season 5 of Reframing Rural Motherhood. Topics for this season include matrescence, or the personal transformation of motherhood, the experience of being pregnant and seeking health care in rural Montana, social isolation in the postpartum period, maternal mental health and farm stress, third spaces for rural families, the impact of childcare and childcare workers on keeping people in rural communities, and the impact of childcare on rural economic resilience. The Bruskys and the Baker Child Care Project examples are just a few of the stories of rural revitalization that I've encountered in the 6 years I've been working on Reframing Rural. I've told cautionary tales of rural gentrification from North Idaho, Shared solution stories of tribal food sovereignty from Danielle Antelope and Latrice Totsi on the Blackfeet Nation. Interviewed ranchers like Laura Keel, a founding board member of Winnedaces, a nonprofit that's fighting to keep ranchers on the land. I've profiled site-specific theater artists and nonprofit leaders like Ash Hansen, founder of the Department of Public Transformation, who is supporting rural community vitality through artist-led activations of third spaces. And I've befriended rural champions like Sarah Calhoun, founder of the Red Ants Pants Foundation and producer of the Red Ants Pants Music Festival, which brings together thousands of people each year to celebrate rural Montana in a cow pasture in White Sulphur Springs. Thanks to funds from the music festival, the Red Ants Pants Foundation has granted more than $200,000 to rural organizations and individuals that further their mission to enrich and promote rural communities. They're also helping raise the next generation of rural women leaders through their Girls Leadership Program, which I support through a rural identity workshop. We are surrounded by stories like these of rural resilience, and we are made of these stories. They help us make sense of the world around us, and they foster hope and action, belonging and togetherness. That's why I commit myself to producing rural stories with heart and with hope. Thank you.
All right. Is it okay if we all sit up here, take a load off? Yeah, great. As if we haven't been sitting for the past hour. That was fantastic, and just so generative for thinking about so many of the themes that we've already been talking about today. And so I want to make sure actually there is time for more than just one question from folks. 3:30. Okay, so we have about half an hour, 25 minutes. So be thinking about that, and we'll open it up after maybe just one question that we can discuss among one another. One of the things that really struck me here, and one of the through lines in each of your really wide and diverse, but also so important and integral work, was the importance of social ties as units of community building in rural areas, but also, I mean, anywhere really. And I was thinking about that in contrast to the sort of a more overtly electoral politics with a capital P panel this morning, where politics is sort of defined as electoral coalitions who elect, leaders who then manifest all kinds of decisions in law and policy. And so I'm just kind of curious, like, how do you think about politics in the work you do on the grassroots level, and in what ways is it both different from, and maybe does it intersect more of those electoral questions that we talked about this morning? Anyone who wants to take that first stab?
Testing. Well, I guess I understand that the narrative on rural America and the narratives that we're all reading today are very overly politicized. So I guess with the work that I do personally, I don't typically engage the people that I'm interviewing with the politics, questions of politics. But one of the questions that was emailed over to me before the panel too, about rural revitalization as a political act. I do think that the storytelling work that I do in terms of rural revitalization is a political act, because stories disrupt the status quo. They disrupt, stereotypes or feelings of isolation. I hope that the story work that I'm doing around agriculture, for instance, gives people ideas for different ways of doing things in the face of large agribusiness corporations. So I guess those are some things that I'm thinking about as far as politics.
Okay. So again, I have to say this is my personal opinion and not the opinion of the Federal Reserve Bank. But a lot of the kind of funding for tribal governments comes from the federal government. That's for a lot of different reasons, but there's a trust and treaty obligation. So a lot of that funding that flows to tribal governments comes from the federal government. A lot of the, for example, I was talking about gaming and federal contracting and things like that are also very tied to federal policy. So tribes are masterful and have mastered the art of the District of Columbia. And they're very pragmatic. They kind of work with everybody in order to ensure that they can take care of their communities. And so that's, there was, I think it was Zach was mentioning this morning, there's kind of a spectrum of political viewpoints in Indian country. But what kind of unites Indian country is they work with whoever will work with them to enable them to thrive in their homelands. So that's my answer to that question.
Well, yeah, I'd just like to echo that. You know, I think that tribal politics and tribal communities there's so many different layers that insulate them from national, state, local politics that kind of usurp a lot of those, you know, issues that so many of us get really wrapped up in that really don't seem to really move the needle or register that much in tribal communities. And so I think they are a bit of an anomaly in terms of the whole national political discussion, and that they do understand that no matter who's in there, they're going to have to keep going back to Washington, D.C. and finding a way to work with them. And then, of course, state as well. And so I think Montana's seen a lot of remarkable stories regarding that over the years, since the state has formed, there's been a lot of, back and forth, but I think recently there's a lot of, collaboration and working together between, nationally elected officials and tribal representatives.
I'm mentally slow enough that I had to think, I'm not sure that I have a very good response, not very much of a political animal, but part of my experience before Old Salt, I was working with Western Landowners Alliance. Got a couple of friends in the room from that organization, and we worked on things like the Endangered Species Act and the Farm Bill and state wildlife policy and water. And I just remember at some point thinking, man, at the pace of progress, if you can call it that happens in a 5-year farm bill, if I stack 5 years farm bills together 5 times, what will life here look like? And it can become so frustrating and abstract, and the pace of change. And so I kind of went into a mode of could we build something close to home in our sphere of influence, a little model that we like better than the regular model. And usually when you go to DC or when you're in the State House in Montana, you're being asked to show examples of what you want. And so we've been kind of head down focused on, can we show what an example of something more regionalized and resilient that actually empowers the people who are in the business? And we've certainly worked hard to access. We have $7 million of federal debt, and we've so far used $650,000 of federal grants. We've accessed about 2.1 million more of federal grants that we haven't used yet. And so we are, actively pursue programs that are out there to help organizations like ours get going. But so far, I think we're still focused on, we're such a polarized state right now. can we demonstrate some areas where where things can work for a spectrum of people, and then perhaps if we have some models to go vouch for it, it'll inform how we participate in policy.
Yeah, that's sort of where I was going with that question, was just sort of in what ways is this sort of like an antidote? Like if you think of politics not as just, you know, whatever policy is enacted in Washington or whatever, however much funding you get or whoever you vote for, but rather this like, it's almost this spiritual act of building connections with another person. And that in and of itself is a political act, the social ties that bind us. I mean, you know, Justin's all about not dunking on spiritual inward journeys or whatever, but yeah, I think there's some, Justin was on his own inward journey this morning when I took him from coffee this morning, and there was no room in the back seat of the car, so had to take out the car seat for my 1-year-old, and he was crouched on the little plastic platform from Wild Crumb to campus. So that had to be some kind of inward journey, but I digress. But I guess what I'm asking is just what kind of, like how it seems like there's actually something quite revolutionary about thinking about the work that you're doing in terms of building community and like acting on this really hyper-local level, individual relationships, individual stories, that is actually quite powerful as an antidote to electoral politics. And maybe that's just my own, I don't want to put too fine of a point on it, but it seemed like that's a through line that struck me about what each of your talks were about. I don't know if anyone wants to add to that before we turn it over to the audience.
I think you're right. Like, you know, I guess I would just say, like, figuring out what our neighbors need and what they're struggling with and what they care about, and then figuring out what's sort of possible right now. Navigating local relationships is kind of where it starts.
Great. All right. Start over here with Kate. I guess we have a microphone.
So we've been talking about community a lot today. And as I was listening to all your wonderful presentations, I was reflecting on sort of the interplay between different types of communities, insiders, outsiders, urban, rural, native, non-native. And I just wondered how you think about that interplay, that bringing together in a healthy way and in a way that is beneficial to rural people and rural communities.
Just kind of touching on reimagining rural, I think, you know, just thinking of the latest data that has been gathered. I know I was fortunate enough to be engaged in a study recently on the Montana reservations about reimagining rural, and it was kind of a follow-up to a study that had been done across the state that excluded the reservations earlier in 2020. But one of the things that really came through was that people are moving to rural areas for quality of life, not because, you know, it's their last ditch. You know, they tried every place else and ended up back here, darn it. You know, like what people are expressing is they're in these communities because there's people there who they care for and love, and, you know, maybe it's intergenerational. But they are making intentional choices to move to areas that are economically depressed often, maybe not the greatest housing situations. They are making sacrifices because there's something there that they value that brings them happiness, and you know, it's a value that is deep in their hearts, and I think that we should utilize that we need to acknowledge that and see how we can bring and celebrate that. And, you know, I'm not a community planner or organizer, and one of those people who knows how to manifest all of those different, all those intentions that people are bringing to rural communities, and some, of course, the folks who are already there. This study that I did was a part of that was following up from the previous study was actually a new movers study. So looking at people who are moving into rural areas, what is their motivation for moving there? I'm not even talking about the people who are already there, right? And the people who are already there, they're invested in those places. They want to see them, they want to see their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren be able to stay there, to have a high quality of life there. And so I feel like finding ways to invest in community that involves elders and children, because people are open to that. I think people want that. And I think finding ways to connect to our elected officials those messages and, aligning ourselves together in rural communities is a very powerful force.
Yeah, and just following up on what Shane was saying, and referencing our presentation this morning on the 1972 Montana Constitution. There's a provision in that Constitution which is unique in the United States. It's the Indian Education for All provision. And the vision of those folks back there in the 1970s was that Montanans would grow up knowing about and understanding the tribes that are here in Montana, and that in some ways have always been here. So that's a profound vision of rural communities understanding each other and working together. The history, though, subsequent to that, especially in the 1980s, was there was a ton of litigation between the state of Montana and tribes, mostly over jurisdictional issues. So there was legal fighting over who controlled what within reservations. And that really did profoundly impact the ability of tribal governments to govern within their own territories and to make investments in their own communities. Now, I think we're through that era. Subsequent to that era, something called the Montana Cooperatives Agreements Act was passed, which allows state and local governments to work cooperatively with tribes to deliver services, to agree on how taxes are going to be imposed and shared, all sorts of things. And I think that's a good embodiment of the direction we're moving in, which is rural communities working together instead of fighting over these issues. Because when there's this fighting, all sorts of, the regions suffer, everybody suffers. So I think there has been an arc of rural communities beginning to work together and try to understand each other. It's been a long journey, though, but I think now in today's like Montana politics, there is a much better understanding of Native communities and a much better overall intent to work in good faith with Native communities to make sure that rural communities aren't undermining each other.
Thank you so much. This was such a great panel. I had a question for Andrew, actually. So you mentioned those improvements in the inequities and on the poverty line, which were great to see. I was just curious, were those like broad-based improvements across all tribes, or were they concentrated among some tribes that improved a lot and kind of pulled up the mean, if that makes sense?
Yeah.
And how that, and the second part is basically related to that. How do, what are the improvements like in Indian country in the Mountain West and specifically?
So that's a great question. Those were statistics, and again, that was statistics up through 2020. And it would be really interesting to see how those changed post-COVID in the last 6 years. But those statistics were averages, so like it was, average of Indian country throughout the nation. But when you look at gaming, that has been a real game changer in Indian country, but the impacts of gaming have been really uneven. So those tribes that are near urban areas and that have kind of exclusive rights to Class 3 gaming, I guess in general, they're doing very well. So about 40%, over 40% of all the gaming revenues annually in the nation for tribes come out of Arizona and Oklahoma. And it's become a huge industry, $43 billion per year. But of course, that means a lot of the rural tribes haven't experienced that same kind of advantage. They do have gaming, but they were also diversifying into other things like the federal contracting and other kinds of businesses. But it's uneven. So I don't have any kind of statistics off the top of my head, but you can visit reservations in Montana and in the Dakotas and elsewhere. And the conditions there are very different from Shakopee or the Seminole or places like that. So uneven, but generally the policies and the improvements are everything is pointing in the right direction.
Good afternoon. I'm a student of Dr. Grant's, and I'm just curious about how moving forward within rural America, I know that we've slightly touched on the ability of commerce, especially within rural America and within the certain reservations around here. But as Mr. Mannix and Lady Torgerson has touched on, is within their own experience, is that commercial food production within produce is limited within around here as compared to, say, beef production, as Mr. Mannix has highlighted before. So I'm just curious about how, do you believe that it could be a possibility as, to increase the job force and provide more of a, like to say, more of a lucrative sense of stability to a rural area, as I assume most of you are from or around here, as you've touched on, lady, that there's very limited businesses or business in general within these rural parts. So I'm curious if you guys do believe that if we can implement some sort of ability to increase accessibility or distribution, or hopefully within home production, that we can not only help our farmers produce more, but also to help them produce healthier families and within themselves more healthier sense of living.
Yeah, I guess the Brewski family that I touched on, they were a conventional farm and ranch, like I mentioned, and then after changing their operation and they're regenerative ranchers, they rotationally graze their cattle. They're moving them like, I think every day, every other day. Now they started out like doing it weekly, but now they have to move their cattle much more frequently. So that requires a lot more labor. And so I think the way that they're now ranching is better for them, better for the local economy because they're creating jobs. And they've even mentioned that they now feel healthier just in the lifestyle changes that they've been making and changing the way they're ranching.
Yeah, I would just say that the more middle market infrastructure and control over the means of production that we can have, instead of, let's say 40 massive packing facilities, what if we had 400 medium-sized ones that created some redundancy in the system and a little bit more value, a little bit of more ability for people in their area to add value and to keep more value in their communities. I think it's a very hard thing to do. In order to do it, we're going to have to mobilize a lot of money into businesses like that, and we're going to have to also at the same time fight power wherever it concentrates downstream. in the food system. It's a steep path, but it's really worth doing. This morning I had breakfast with Morgan Tweet with them trying to establish the middle market infrastructure that it takes to get hemp to market. Little example of a bright spot that's worth paying attention to, I think. I guess the other thing I would say is just kind of back to the insiders, outsiders question, and more of a spiritual thing. You know, my own family has been in the Blackfoot for a while now, but we're outsiders and insiders. We were part of exploitation. We learned to live in a place and try to love it. And we got a lot more work to do. And I think the main question now is not like, were you born here? Are you from here? And it's more about what will you give and commit to this place. And the way you start to build the ability to see to sort of see yourself as part of something larger and to serve, the community, I think you need to, break bread together and sing and dance together. And it's part of what happens at something like a Red Ants Pants Festival, and we try to do at Old Salt Festival, and that has a long history of singing and dancing together. I think that we need to do a lot more of that.
That is a great place to end. Please join me in thanking our panelists.